Very glad to be here and to talk about you about the question where to place a phrase. And we try to merge an informational and a generative approach to phrasal extraposition in early New High German. So to do so, we have the following roadmap. First, I want to talk a bit about the phenomenon of extraposition in basically New High German, but from its very beginning. Before I present you the model we use for our informational approach, which is information density, then some words about our corpus, method, and annotation will follow before I can present you the results and the first discussion. And the final part, the generative approach, will be presented by Augustin. So let's start with the phenomenon and have a look at the following sentence. Ich will Feindschaft setzen zwischen der Schlangensamen und des Weibessamen. I want to create hostility between the snakes and the women's seed. As you can see in the table, we can divide a German sentence into 5 parts, 2 of which build one of the main characteristics of the German language, the so-called sentence frame, which is said to be fully established in the early New High German period. The sentence frame consists of the left sentence bracket and the right sentence bracket, short LSB and RSB in our presentation here, where the parts of the predicate of the verb are distributed. The right sentence bracket is usually set to build the end of the sentence. So usually when we have material behind it in the postfield, it's subordinate clauses. But as you might know and see in this example, constituents or part of constituents can also be placed there, but it's not the most canonical word order for German. So we must have some triggers to place material here. Most former research basically say that these triggers are all connected with information and with the fact that speakers try to ensure successful communication. So they say material is placed in the postfield when it becomes too lengthy. So we want to prevent the middle field from being too big and the distance between the sentence brackets from being too far apart. So the second explanation for placing material in the postfield is information. And most studies I'm aware of are concerned with focus or given and new information as an explanation. We want to propose a different informational approach, which is a bit more mathematical and which has the advantage that it has been well correlated with processing efforts and is usable for corpus data as well. So we want to present information density to you. Information density basically describes information as the probability of occurrence of a word in its context. So the less expectable a word is in its context, the more information it contains. In Shannon's classical approach, this is quite a local phenomenon. So if we have a change in the position of certain linguistic material, this already might improve the transmission of the information and therefore also the communication itself. I want to make this point clearer in the next 2 slides. Before that, please note here that information density is never concerned with a change or an influence on the proposition of the sentence. It's only about its coding. So, as promised, we can look at the following model, which I guess most of you know. So we have a communicational model consisting of a speaker who tries to convey a message consisting of words 1 to 7. He tries to transmit this message through a channel which has a certain capacity and which shall reach a recipient who shall understand the whole message if the communication is successful. So how does a speaker transmit this message? When we know that the symbols are incremental and dependent on each other and on the symbol itself. So let's assume for this example that that we have a language with total free word order. And so it would be grammatical, but highly unlikely to have a message looking like this. If you look at this, we would have information loss in the words 2, 5, and 6, because they're outside the range of this channel. So word 2 would be far too surprising, would have too much information to be fully processed when it's combined with word 1 at the beginning of the sentence. Word 5 would be too unlikely, and word 6 in this combination, in this frame, again, too unlikely. Sorry, word 5 would be too likely. So how do speakers cope with such problems? Basically, they just change the coding of this message to prevent this channel from being overloaded. So we look at this message now and we see every word is within the channel. The communication would be successful. You see that I chose a line graph to present this message. Actually, if we use information density, we get those line graphs on real data, because with this method, as I mentioned, it's quite mathematically, we can assign a certain value to every word in a message, a text, whatever. This is based on a stochastic process and on probability theory. So if we talk today about information, we're talking about surprisal values, which are calculated using the negative logarithm of the probability of an element given its context. You can see the formula on the slide. I have also already mentioned that information density has been quite well connected with processing efforts and cognitive resources. We know that a human cognitive resource is limited and that speakers design their texts to ensure an optimal processing despite these limits. We also know that information density can be applied on every aspect of language. So we might have it on a phonetic level. So we pronounce expected words quicker than unexpected ones. But for our talk today, we basically want to concentrate on word order. So how can we combine extraposition and information density? Well, we use another idea, which has first been presented by Gibson and Hawkins, who say that we have a different channel capacity, different cognitive resources available for the first 4 parts of the sentence and the postfield. So we assume that material which is highly surprising, which has high surprisal values, is better placed in the postfield than in the middle field due to this change in channel capacity. So this leads to our hypothesis. We say that higher surprisal values of phrases favor extraposition. And we want to make this exemplary on prepositional phrases. To do so, we conducted a corpus study with texts taken from the Deutsches Textarchiv, the DTA, because these texts were pre-processed, basically tokenized and lemmatized. So our whole language modeling is done on the lemmatized words, because we're interested more in the content than in grammatical features. We chose a sub-context corpus of scientific and theological texts, and we looked at a period from 1650 to 1900, and we divided this 250-year period into 50-year steps to be able to account for some diachronic change as well. Today's talk will show you the results of 22 texts containing more than 300,000 tokens after having excluded sentences without a phenomenon of extraposition. We found in these 22 texts 698 prepositional phrases, which can further be divided into 399 extraposed PPs, and 299 embedded PPs. I'll explain the difference between those in a minute. Oops, sorry. Since the annotation of the DTA, the pre-processing, is quite old and not so useful for our kind of investigation, we had to do the annotation manually using WebAnno. And we have to thank Katrin Ortmann at this point for setting up and curating WebAnno, and our two student assistants, Niels Dörr and Katharina Wilhelm, for helping with the annotation. So basically, we annotated the sentence brackets and the prepositional phrase itself. When the prepositional phrase is behind the right sentence bracket, we called it extraposed. This was the first step we did. In a second step, we looked if we can find a minimal pair of embedded prepositional phrases which had the same preposition and at least similar attributes, or at the very least a similar length. This was not possible in every case, and here you have the explanation why the numbers of embedded and extraposed prepositional phrases don't exactly match. So for our surprisal values, we calculated a skipgram language model because it is more suitable for smaller amounts of data and can capture a context quite well. We then calculated cumulative means and mean surprisal values and the length of our extraposed phrases. To see which of these factors is most influential, we checked it using a logistic regression done with R. For the results, we already see that we have quite a difference in numbers when we look at prepositional phrases. Most prepositional phrases were found in the period from 1700 to 1750, followed by the period 1800 to 1850, followed by the period of 1650 to 1750, and then the period of 1850 to 1900, so our youngest period. And finally, least prepositional phrases were found in the period of 1750 to 1800. To continue with some graphs, when we look at the cumulative surprisal values, we apparently see that they are in fact higher for extraposed prepositional phrases than for their in situ counterparts. So this might hint an influence. For the mean surprisal values, the picture is not as clear or does not seem to be as easily interpretable when we just look at this graph. So this is where our logistic regression actually helps us. We did it and then used a backward model selection done with ANOVA to see which of the models we get actually explains our data best. When we looked at the whole data, we also included two random effects of the authors and the genre. And we found that neither the interactions nor the mean surprisal value nor author or genre has any influence on the position of those prepositional phrases. And especially for author and genre, this is quite nice. So we see that what we find is not just attributed to writing style differences. Unfortunately, we could not show a significant result for the cumulative surprisal values of the whole data, but for length. So apparently length is the best predictor and information density does not have such a great influence. But this was the result for our whole data. And because it's a really long time span, we looked at our 50-year spans separately. This seemed to be quite fruitful because at least for the period from 1650 to 1700, we found what we expected. So cumulative surprisal values have produced a highly significant result. And apparently PPs with a higher cumulative surprisal value in this period tend to be extraposed, whereas length doesn't influence this. This result changes only 50 years later, and it won't change for the rest of our period. So interestingly, for the period from 1700 to 1750, we find that high mean surprisal values favor embedding, but it's only slightly significant. And from now on, length will remain the most significant result. So long prepositional phrases are placed in the postfield according to our data. So you see absolutely no change for the next two periods, and also not for the last one. So to conclude this, cumulative surprisal values, when they're high, only influence extraposition in the period from 1650 to 1700. Mean surprisal value influence embedding in the period from 1700 to 1750. And for most periods, length is the best predictor. So unfortunately, we did not find evidence for our hypothesis, which was totally surprising because we did find evidence on data from the very same corpus, but for the extraposition of relative clauses. So we wondered, what are the differences? What are similarities? And we found that we knew we only looked at attributive relative clauses, but we didn't make this distinction in our prepositional data. So this was what we did then. And we surprisingly found that only 22 of our extraposed prepositional phrases are attributive. That's only 5.5%. So we wondered, is there some difference between attributive prepositional phrases and independent ones? Again, we have a graph, and again, this looks as if there was some difference in the surprisal value, which could be significant. We don't know it because doing statistics on 22 examples does not lead to very useful results. But still, we propose a similar analysis for the extraposition of relative clauses and prepositional phrases. And this is what will be presented by Augustin.
Okay, thanks, Sophia. Next slide, please. Are there some things which can be learned about the structure of the postfield or of extraposition in German? And the first question we have to ask there is, of course, what is the postfield anyway in generative terms? Next, please. So the classical approach is that we have an instance of extraposition and subsequent adjunction. Other approaches next are that we have a variable base. This goes back to Heider, for instance. That is that some VPs are right-headed, as you learn it in school, but some are left-headed, and these are the ones where you get a post field in some ways. And next one, there is also the assumption that it could be a post-syntactical phenomenon. So something which happens on PF somewhere. And most recently, people settled for mixed models. For instance, Inaba and Frey most recently, and I'm relying mostly on Frey for the next for this part of the presentation. He makes a distinction between attributive and non-attributive phrases. Non-attributive phrases he sees as base generated in the postfield, so he adopts approach B. Whereas for attributive phrases, he assumes approach C, that it's a post-syntactic phenomenon. Let's look at this from the light of our data on the next slide. So is there evidence for either approach? So the first thing we have to say is that attributive material cannot be base generated in postfield for general reasons. Next. So because there should be a C-comment relation between the nominal head and its complement, because we every now and then get assignment of morphosyntactic features to the complement, and this should happen via governant, that is via C-comment. Next, please. So if the Postfield now is an adjunction to some higher projection like little VP or TP, or so, we wouldn't get a C-comment relation in most cases. Next, please. So this is an example from the Corpus, auf das sie Macht erhalten über den Baum des Lebens. Macht, power, governs the prepositional phrase headed by over as its complement, and as you see on the graph, next please, there is just no way to get a C-comment relation between the DP Macht and the prepositional phrase if it's somehow, well, as a matter of fact, it doesn't matter whether it's base generated up there or it's attached up there. So this is just no way. But with base generation, it would be even worse, because then we didn't even have a trace where the government could take place. Next, please. So, but an extraposition, that is a movement approach, faces certain problems anyway, and Werner Frey has elaborated on that. For instance, that we get data like here in B, that if we put two WH phrases into the post field, we get unacceptable results. But if we put the same phrases without an WH word in it, we don't get unacceptable results. And this is not clear why crossing should be disallowed with WH expressions, but not with normal phrases, so to say. Next, please. Also, it has been shown that that attributes are in the post field are sensitive to prosody, so there should be no intervening phonological phrase. Therefore, A is kind of deviant, because we have there a phonological phrase, die räumige Zeit, between the head noun and the attribute to it. Whereas as soon as they are adjacent, that there's no phonological phrase intervening, the sentence is okay. This indicates actually that it is in fact a PF phenomenon. Next, please. And if we look at our corpus at the 22 examples of attributive prepositional phrases, we indeed find no instance in which we have a phonological phrase intervening. It's mostly only the material in the right sentence bracket, sometimes some particles, like in this example, einige Unterschiede kann man noch machen, but von dem Orte, wo der Bruch geschehen, but it's quite clear that the unstressed particles and stuff like man wouldn't form a phonological phrase on its own. Next, please. And also, he showed that the depth of embedding is kind of irrelevant, which would be hard of derive under either a base generation approach or a movement approach. Next, please. So, so probably the seeing it as a PF phenomenon is really a good idea. And the question is now, how exactly would that look like? And we say the first thing is that we see that the two types of clearly attributive material, which Sophia talked about, namely attributive PPs and relative clauses, share a sensitivity to the information density. But when should information density play a role in clause generation? Well, we could think that it should be relatively early in the planning, when reference and predicates are retrieved from the mental lexicon or the common ground, because this material comes with a price tag, and which is information density in the end, that potentially overtaxes the working memory capacity. But if we assume that lexical insertion takes place only late, as it's done, for instance, in distributed morphology or so, we shouldn't actually expect that information density plays a role when you do like your syntax proper, so to say, but only when you do lexical insertion, because the structures are really don't care about information density. Okay, so this could be this could be playing a role on when you do lexical insertion. Next, please. We talked also about length, and we saw that length is a better predictor for most of the cases, and especially probably for the non-attributive PPs. When should length play a role in clause generation? This is completely clear that this should doesn't play a role in phrase generation, but has ramifications for the prosody. So this is also something which seems to be a PF element, but only one which applies after lexical insertion has taken place, obviously. So next. So actually, we might want to think of PF in itself as a procedural module. Next, please. So we get some output of narrow syntax. Next, we move and merge material potentially in order to get to a position where we do lexical insertion. Then we apply further operations next till we get in order to do information packaging, and in the end, next we do a prosody assignment, and of course the post field, and of course the post field generation would be in some cases somewhere when lexical insertion takes place, in order to not overtax the language capacity, and sometimes when it is a matter of prosody assignment. So we probably have like really two different stages of the duration within PF here visible, and this is actually what we wanted to talk about. So thank you very much for your attention. Or Sophia, do you have some wrap-up remarks? Okay, so that's it. Thank you.